The Siege of Shadow Hollow. The autumn mist clung to the mountains surrounding Big Stone Gap like a shroud, thick and cold as death itself. It was October 1864, and the war had finally crawled its way into these remote Virginia hills, for Big Stone Gap sat not in North Carolina, but in the southwestern corner of Virginia, where the Appalachian Mountains twisted like the spine of some ancient, sleeping beast. Lieutenant James Rutherford of the 5th Kentucky Infantry had been marching for 3 days straight when his company stumbled upon the gap. They were Confederate scouts, separated from their regiment during a skirmish near the Cumberland Gap, and now they sought only shelter and a night's rest before attempting to rejoin their unit. The war had made ghosts of them all. 23 men who had left Kentucky with songs on their lips now trudged in silence, their eyes hollow, their uniforms more holes than fabric. "Sir," whispered Private Daniel Moss, a boy of barely 17 whose smooth cheeks had never known a razor, "there's something wrong with this place." James felt it too. The forest around them had gone deathly quiet. No birds sang in the twisted oaks, no squirrels chattered in the pines. Even the wind seemed reluctant to move through these mountains, as if the very air feared to disturb whatever slept here. They found the town just as the sun began its descent behind the ridgeline. Big Stone Gap was little more than a collection of log cabins and rough-hewn buildings clustered in the valley, where the mountains formed a natural gap. Smoke rose from a few chimneys, but there was no movement in the muddy streets, no children playing, no women hanging laundry, no men tending to livestock. "It's abandoned," said Sergeant William Cole, a grizzled veteran whose face bore the scars of Shiloh and Stone's River. "Let's take shelter in that big house yonder and move on at first light." The house he indicated stood apart from the others, a 2-story structure of dark wood that seemed to absorb rather than reflect what little light remained in the dying day. Its windows were like empty eye sockets, and the front door hung slightly ajar, creaking in a breeze that James couldn't feel. As they approached, James noticed strange marks carved into the doorframe, symbols he didn't recognize, angular and harsh, like the scratch marks of claws or the desperate warnings of someone who had lost the ability to form letters. His hand instinctively moved to the revolver at his hip. "Probably just Cherokee markings," Cole said, though his voice lacked conviction. "This was their land once." They pushed through the door, and the interior swallowed them in darkness. The men fumbled for candles and soon had a few lit, casting dancing shadows across walls covered in faded floral wallpaper that peeled away like dead skin. The furniture remained: a dining table with 6 chairs, a grandfather clock frozen at 3:33, and a massive stone fireplace that dominated one wall. What they didn't find was any sign of the occupants. No personal effects, no clothing, no food in the kitchen. It was as if the family had simply vanished mid-task, abandoning everything but themselves. "Build a fire," James ordered, trying to shake the unease that had settled over him like a wet blanket. "Set watch rotations. We leave at dawn." As darkness fell completely, the men huddled around the fireplace, grateful for its warmth despite the October chill that seemed to seep through the walls. They spoke in low voices, sharing hardtack and what little salt pork remained in their packs. Private Moss pulled out a battered harmonica and began to play a mournful tune, Lorna, the song every soldier knew, about a love left behind. He never finished the first verse. The grandfather clock, which had stood silent and dead since their arrival, suddenly began to tick. The sound was unnaturally loud in the quiet house, each tick echoing like a hammer blow. Then it began to chime deep, resonant tones that seemed to come not from the clock itself, but from somewhere deep beneath the floorboards. 1, 2, 3. "It's just a clock," Cole said, but his hand had found his rifle. 4, 5, 6. The fire in the hearth flickered and dimmed, though no wind had stirred. 7, 8, 9. Moss dropped his harmonica. In the sudden silence after the clatter, they could all hear it, footsteps on the floor above them. Slow, deliberate footsteps, back and forth, as if someone were pacing. 10, 11, 12. The clock fell silent and the footsteps stopped. "Who's up there?" James called out, his voice steadier than he felt. "Show yourself." No answer came, but the temperature in the room had plummeted. Their breath now came out in visible puffs, and frost began to form on the windows despite the fire. "Could be civilians hiding," suggested Corporal Hayes, though even he didn't believe it. James made a decision. "Cole, Hayes, Moss with me. The rest of you stay here and keep that fire going." They climbed the narrow staircase, their boots loud on the wooden steps. The second floor consisted of 4 bedrooms and a small sitting area. Each room was as empty as the first floor had been, filled with furniture but devoid of life. Beds were made with military precision. Wash basins sat filled with water that had long since grown a film of dust. In one room, a child's toy, a wooden horse, sat in the middle of the floor, rocking gently back and forth despite the still air. "There's no one here, sir," Moss whispered, his voice cracking. But James had found something. In the largest bedroom, a leather-bound journal lay on the nightstand. He opened it and tilted it toward the candle he carried. The handwriting was shaky, deteriorating from neat script to desperate scrawl across the pages. October 15, 1862. We arrived in Big Stone Gap a fortnight ago, seeking refuge from the war. My wife Mary believes this place will keep us safe, far from the armies that tear the country apart. The locals are strange folk, quiet and watchful, but they've welcomed us well enough. Our daughter Elizabeth has taken to the mountains, exploring the caves and hollows with the abandon of youth. I pray we have made the right choice. He flipped forward several pages. October 28, 1862. Elizabeth came home today speaking of voices in Shadow Hollow, the deep ravine north of town. She says they call to her, promising secrets and treasures. I have forbidden her from returning there. The local minister, Reverend Blackwood, came to call this evening. He warned us most severely about Shadow Hollow. Said things went missing there, animals, people, even their shadows, he claimed. I thought him mad until I saw his eyes. He believed every word. More pages, the handwriting growing wilder. November 3, 1862. Mary has begun sleepwalking. Each night she rises and walks to the window facing north, toward that accursed hollow. She stares for hours, and when I wake her, she remembers nothing. Elizabeth's behavior has changed as well. She no longer plays or laughs. She sits and stares and whispers to herself in a language I do not know. November 10, 1862. They came for the first time last night. I do not know what they are. Shadows with substance, voices without bodies. They scratch at the walls and call our names in voices that sound almost but not quite human. I have carved protective symbols on the doors and windows, sigils the Reverend gave me before he disappeared 3 days ago. His church stands empty now. So does the school. So do most of the houses. People are leaving in the night, fleeing into the mountains. We cannot leave. Mary and Elizabeth will not go. They say the voices will follow us anywhere now. We are marked. James's hands trembled as he read the final entry. November 15, 1862. It is nearly midnight and I know they will come for us soon. I have tried everything, prayer, iron, salt, the old protections my grandmother taught me in the old country. Nothing works. The shadows grow stronger each night, more solid, more real. Last night I saw one clearly by moonlight. It had Mary's face, but the eyes. God help me, the eyes were endless darkness. And in that darkness I saw other faces, dozens of them, hundreds maybe, all screaming silently. Elizabeth is gone. She walked into Shadow Hollow this morning and Mary followed. I tried to stop them, but they were too strong, far too strong for a woman and child. They moved like puppets on strings, jerked along by invisible hands. I followed to the edge of the hollow, but I could not make myself descend. The darkness there is absolute, and from its depths I heard my daughter's voice, but it was not my daughter speaking. The voice was ancient and hungry and full of malice. I returned home to write this warning. If you are reading these words, leave this place. Leave Big Stone Gap. Leave Virginia if you can. The war between the states is nothing compared to the war being waged here, a war far older, a war between light and something that dwells in places where light has never reached. They are at the door now, scratching, calling my name in Mary's voice. I will not let them in, but I know they will find a way. They always find a way. May God have mercy on my soul. May He have mercy on us all. The journal ended there. James looked up at his men, their faces pale in the candlelight. "We're leaving," he said, "now." A child's laughter echoed through the empty house. They ran for the stairs, but the steps had changed. There were more of them now, far more than they had climbed. They descended, and still the first floor did not appear. The walls around them began to weep, not water, but something thick and dark that stank of copper and rot. "This isn't real," Moss sobbed. "This can't be real." Then the shadows began to move. They peeled themselves from the walls like living things, taking vague humanoid shapes that flickered and reformed constantly. James could see faces in them, not the faces of the family who had written the journal, but the faces of soldiers. Confederate and Union alike, their features frozen in expressions of terror and agony. "Run!" James shouted, and they did, finally bursting through a door that opened onto the first floor. The other men were on their feet, weapons drawn, staring at something outside the windows. The town had changed. Where there had been a dozen buildings, now there were hundreds, all identical to the house they occupied. And in the street, if it could still be called a street, stood a crowd of figures. They had the shapes of men, women, and children, but they were made of shadow, and where their eyes should have been, there was only that endless, hungry darkness. "What are they?" someone screamed. James didn't have an answer. He could only watch as the shadow people began to move toward the house, their movements wrong, joints bending in impossible directions, heads turning too far, mouths opening far too wide. "Barricade the door," Cole shouted, and the men scrambled to obey, pushing furniture against the entrance. But even as they worked, James knew it was futile. These things weren't bound by doors and walls. They were already inside, had always been inside, were perhaps the house itself. The fire in the hearth suddenly roared to life, flames shooting up the chimney with such force that the men staggered back. And in those flames James saw her, a woman made of fire and fury, her hair streaming like burning silk, her eyes the color of molten gold. "Fools," she said, and her voice was the crackling of timber in a blaze. "You trespass in Shadow's domain." "We meant no harm," James said, finding his voice though every instinct screamed at him to run. "We're just soldiers seeking shelter." "There is no shelter here," the firewoman said. "This place was claimed long ago, in a war you cannot imagine. The entity you call Shadow was old when your ancestors first learned to fear the dark. It feeds on those who stray too close to its hollow, draws them in with promises and whispers, and takes not just their lives but their very essence." "The family," James began, "were the last. Before them there were others, before them still more. Cherokee, Shawnee, peoples whose names have been forgotten, all fed to the darkness. I am a Shara, bound here by my own folly, cursed to warn those who will not listen." The flames of her form flickered and dimmed. "It grows stronger. The war you fight, the blood you spill, it feeds on that too. All that death, all that sorrow." The scratching at the walls grew louder, more insistent. The shadow people had reached the house, and now they pressed against it from all sides. The walls began to bulge inward, wood groaning under impossible pressure. "How do we fight it?" James demanded. Ashara laughed, a sound like wind through a burning building. "You don't. You can only run and pray you can outrun the darkness. But know this, if you flee north toward the Hallow, you will be lost. Your only hope is south, through the true gap in the mountains. If you can reach it before midnight, you might escape this place. But Shadow will not let you go easily. It will send its taken ones after you. It will twist the very land against you." "It's not yet midnight," Cole said, checking his pocket watch. "We have 20 minutes. "Then run," Ashara said, and with a final flare she vanished, leaving only normal flames crackling in the hearth. The front door exploded inward, furniture scattering like leaves. The shadow people poured in, and James got his first clear look at them. They were hollow, these things, skins stretched over emptiness, mouths opening onto voids, eyes that showed not darkness but absence, the complete lack of anything. And they were fast. "Out the back!" James shouted, and his men didn't need to be told twice. They ran through the kitchen, kicking open the rear door, and burst out into the night. The town had transformed completely. The buildings were everywhere now, an impossible maze of identical structures stretching in all directions. The sky above was wrong, no stars, no moon, just a vast emptiness that seemed to press down on them with physical weight. But to the south, James could see it, a break in the mountains, a genuine gap through which moonlight shone like a beacon. It couldn't have been more than a mile away, but the streets between here and there twisted like a labyrinth. They ran. Behind them, the shadow people gave chase, and their pursuit was accompanied by sounds that would haunt James for the rest of his days. The screaming of wind through caves, the creaking of trees in ice storms, the death rattles of drowning men, all blended into a cacophony of supernatural horror. Private Moss tripped, stumbling over nothing. Before he could regain his feet, the shadows were upon him. James tried to reach him, but Cole grabbed his arm. "He's gone," the sergeant shouted. "We can't help him." James watched in horror as Moss was enveloped by the shadow people. The boy screamed once, twice, and then nothing. When the shadows pulled back, Moss stood where he had fallen, but his eyes were empty voids, and his mouth opened wider than any human mouth should, revealing only darkness within. The thing that had been Moss joined the pursuit. They ran through streets that shifted and changed, buildings rearranging themselves to block their path. Corporal Hayes fired his rifle at the pursuing shadows, but the bullets passed through them without effect. One of the shadow people reached for him, and where its hand touched Hayes's shadow on the ground, the corporal screamed. His shadow detached from his feet, rising up like a living thing, and wrapped itself around him like a strangling snake. Hayes fell and didn't rise. 20 men became 15, 15 became 12, 12 became 8. The gap in the mountains seemed no closer, though they'd been running for what felt like hours. James's lungs burned, his legs were leaden, and his heart hammered against his ribs like it was trying to escape. Then Cole, brave Cole, who had survived 2 years of war, stumbled. He caught himself, but in doing so he looked back. His scream was cut short as his body simply inverted. In an instant that defied sanity, Cole turned inside out, his organs and bones and muscle all where his skin should have been. He collapsed in a wet heap, and the shadows descended upon him like flies on carrion. "Don't look back," James shouted to the remaining men. "Whatever you do, don't look back." But it was so tempting. The sounds behind them, the screaming, the weeping, the whispered names of wives and mothers and sweethearts, all designed to make them turn, to make them see. Private Daniels looked back. He aged 50 years in 5 seconds, his face collapsing into wrinkles, his hair going white then falling out, his body withering until he was nothing but a desiccated husk that crumbled to dust. 7 men left, then 6, then 5. The gap was closer now, so close James could feel genuine wind on his face, air that came from outside this nightmare realm. 100 yards, 50, 25. Something cold wrapped around James's ankle. He looked down, a mistake, and saw his own shadow had turned against him, had become a hand that gripped with impossible strength. He fell hard, his chin striking the cobblestones, blood filling his mouth. The remaining men, just 4 now, hesitated, torn between escape and loyalty. "Go," James screamed at them. "That's an order, go." They went, and James couldn't blame them. He tried to drag himself forward, but his shadow held him fast, was pulling him backward now, back toward the darkness and the hollow and the thing that dwelt there. He could feel it now, the presence he'd sensed since arriving in Big Stone Gap. It was vast beyond comprehension, ancient beyond measure, and hungry with a hunger that could never be satisfied. It wanted him. It wanted to add him to its collection, to make him another shadow puppet in its endless court of the damned. James fumbled for his revolver, knowing bullets would be useless but unable to simply give up. His hand closed around the grip, and he felt something else, the leather journal he'd thrust into his belt when they'd fled the house. The journal. Firewoman Ashara had appeared from the hearth, from flames. Fire was the enemy of shadow, wasn't it? James pulled out the journal, then struck a match from his tinderbox with trembling fingers. The tiny flame seemed impossibly bright in this place of darkness. He set the journal alight. The effect was immediate. The shadow hand released him as if burned, recoiling back into its proper place on the ground. But the journal burned with an unnatural fire, flames spreading across its pages in patterns that looked almost like writing, like the dying words of the man who'd written it were being spoken one final time in letters of light. James held the burning book high and ran. The shadows shrank back from it, and the buildings around him began to fade, becoming translucent, insubstantial. The ground beneath his feet felt more solid, more real. He burst through the gap in the mountains and kept running, not daring to stop, not daring to look back. Behind him, he heard a sound like the world itself screaming in fury and frustration, the cry of something ancient and powerful being denied its prey. When he finally stopped, the journal had burned to ash in his hands, and dawn was breaking over real mountains, real forest, real earth. He turned slowly, fearfully, and looked back. Big Stone Gap was gone. In its place was nothing but empty valley, overgrown with trees and brush as if no town had ever stood there at all. Of the 4 men who'd escaped ahead of him, James found no sign. He searched for hours, calling their names, but received no answer. Whether they'd made it out or been claimed at the last moment by the darkness, he would never know. Lieutenant James Rutherford eventually found his way back to his regiment. He tried to tell his story, but no one believed him. They thought the stress of war had broken his mind, that he'd hallucinated the entire experience. He was given medical leave and sent home to Kentucky. He never spoke of Big Stone Gap again, but sometimes, in the dead of night, he would wake in a cold sweat, convinced he could hear scratching at his walls and voices calling his name in tones that were almost, but not quite, human. And on moonless nights, when the darkness was complete, James would check his reflection to make sure his shadow still matched his movements. Because he had heard, in those final moments before escaping that cursed place, something the fire woman had not told him. Shadow never forgot those who escaped. Shadow was patient. And one day, when James least expected it, when he was old and tired and his guard was down, the scratching would come again. The shadows would come again. They always did.